This week in the Regency, it's all about duels. Duels and dueling. And the reason that I got onto this particular subject was a 28th of January 1812 article that was reported in a lot of different papers, not just one. Mr. Wellesley-Pole to Miss Tilney-Long, the richest heiress in Britain. This is an engagement. This marriage has created more fashionable conversation than any marriage for a long time in consequence of the duel that was fought on her occasion between Mr. Pole and Lord Kilworth. Her refusal, according to report, of the hand of a royal duke, and other circumstances that have been detailed in the papers. I'll tell you about that in a minute. Miss Long, before her marriage, settled £3,000 per annum on her mother and made a present of £10,000 to each of her sisters. Now, that's a huge amount of money, like enormous. It says it's a report of a marriage, but in fact, on diving further into this, I discovered that the marriage didn't take place until February, and I will come back in February and tell you about that particular story. So I thought, oh, a real duel between two people I can actually name, I can follow it. And indeed, I could follow it. And it turned out to be really complicated. First of all, let's look at two of the players. Here is Catherine Tilney-Long. Names get incredibly long in this story. After he married her, he was Mr. Wellesley-Pole Tilney-Long. And they get long because there are these really rich families who don't have any sons. And in the end, it all comes to Catherine. If you couldn't give it to the eldest son, you gave it to the eldest daughter. And she was incredibly rich. Incredibly rich. So rich, it's like, billionaire kind of rich. This is her house. And you can see why a lot of people would want to marry her, including William Wellesley-Pole. This is him. I couldn't find an image of Lord Kilworth, unfortunately, but we do know, until he was really, really old. I thought, well, that's irrelevant. And also it was a caricature. It wasn't very nice. And I have fond feelings towards Lord Kilworth, but he was only 19 at this point, and he was the Earl's grandson, an Irish earldom, and Mountcashel, and he eventually became the Earl of Mountcashel. And weirdly enough, Wellesley-Pole was also the grandson of an Earl. And more importantly, from our point of view, for the Regency, he was the nephew of the Duke of Wellington. Now, at this point, he's not the Duke of Wellington. He gets made the Duke of Wellington later, but he's very important, obviously, as a general. And later on, he becomes Prime Minister, which we'll hear more about in February. So, why did they have a duel? Well, it turns out that it was reported quite widely in the papers. There were exchanges of letters to the editor about it. But first, a little bit of background on dueling. Dueling was illegal. It had been made illegal in 1654. And there's a lot of talk about, when you read articles on dueling, about how, the Enlightenment changed and blah, 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 blah. I think the main reason that dueling was made illegal was that people started using pistols. So when you fight with the sword, which was what most duels were prior to this, there's a very good chance that you can disable your opponent or win without actually killing them. Wounding them might kill them, even if it was a slight wound, because no antibiotics. And that was why when you fought a duel with swords, you took your the top half of your clothes off, your shirt off, because if you drove a sword into someone, you could take some of the fabric, some bits of cotton or linen with the sword, and it would fester and you would get gangrene and die. And so people took their tops off, a thing I feel that most historical novels, like movies and films, really should get right for the sake of the viewers. Then pistols came along, and there's a wave of making duels illegal, and it seems to follow when pistols became fashionable to use, and they became fashionable in England very early, later in France and Germany and so on. And so most of them didn't really make dueling illegal until much later in the Victorian period. But also it remained legal even in Britain between officers in the army or navy, I presume, until 1844. And in fact, one guy, he actually got court-martialed because he didn't duel. So he was insulted in public. He didn't challenge the guy who insulted him, and they court-martialed him. And that was in the mid-1800s. After the ban on dueling had come in, so this is the 1850s, ban came in 1844 for the military, and he was still court-martialed after that, even though it was illegal. So that kind of code of honor, you have to defend your honor, it lasted a lot longer in the military than it did in the aristocracy, it seems. So when Mr. Wellesley-Pole and Lord Kilworth duelled, they were breaking the law. And not only were they breaking the law, but their seconds were breaking the law as well. So the second was usually the guy's best friend, and he and the other guy's best friend would organize everything. They would, typically organize when and where it was. They would all, between themselves, they would agree when and where the duel was going to happen, usually very early in the morning in a park somewhere, although sometimes inside a private house. They would organize a doctor to be there, and they would keep a lookout for police. Well, not actually police, because there were no police at this period, but both street runners or local constables or sheriffs, because indeed it was illegal. Now, it's one of those laws that people didn't really follow up on much, and they could, everybody knew these guys had dueled, but nobody got arrested, and that was because no one died. So the 1654 statute makes death by dueling murder. And this was the first time that had been considered murder. Up until then, if it was a fair fight, it's too bad. You knew what you were risking when you got into it. It wasn't a question for the law to answer. But after 1654, if you killed someone, then you were considered a murderer. And so were the people who helped you set it up. So if, say, you've got a second each, and one of the duelists dies, all three of the other people have to leave the country, because the punishment for murder was death, and the punishment for setting it up was banishment, exile. And if they were caught in Britain afterwards, after the banishment had been pronounced on them, they were killed. So everybody took off for the continent. Probably the reason that duels kind of went down a bit in this period with the Napoleonic Wars, when it was a lot harder to get to Europe. Okay, so we have Mr. Pole and Mr. Kilworth. They're about to commit a crime. Everybody knows it's a crime. Nobody much cares unless someone gets killed. And with pistols, of course, it's much more likely you're going to die. Both of them were considered good shots. So why did it happen? And what did it have to do with Miss Tilney-Long? Well, it turns out that everybody knew Wellesley-Pole was courting Tilney-Long, Miss Tilney-Long. Her name was actually Catherine. Let's call her Catherine. But apparently he had first cast eyes upon her sister. And there were some what you might call scurrilous verses in the newspaper about this. And I will put a link in the video description to a post where I give you the verses. And Lord Kilworth thought that was funny. And so people were joking around, probably at a gentleman's club or at a ball or something like that. And Lord Kilworth made a joke about this poem that had been in the newspaper mocking Wellesley-Pole. And Wellesley-Pole thought that Lord Kilworth had written these verses and challenged him. So their seconds get together, they organise the meeting. When they get to the actual place, the seconds start talking to each other, and one of the duties of the seconds is to try to come to an agreement. And so ideally, the person who has injured the other person apologizes, and Lord Kilworth's going, I'm not apologizing, I didn't write them. And so they sort it all out. And they shake hands, there's no apology, everybody agrees there was a misunderstanding. Okay, fine. Remembering at this point that Lord Kilworth is 19 and Mr. Pole is 20, and they were drunk when the challenge was given and accepted. And then in the cold light of morning, perhaps didn't look such a good idea. But anyway, Lord Kilworth says, no, I did not write those verses. The seconds get to come to an agreement. It's all done, we think. But no, because somebody writes to the paper and says that Wellesley-Pole apologised. And then he gets in a snit and goes, I did not, and writes an entirely new letter to the editor going, I certainly did not apologise. And then, he does look a bit, as you can see in this portrait, he does look a bit kind of stubborn and prone to anger. But he writes to the papers, and then the seconds get involved and explain what happened. And there's another very long article about it in the paper. And it all ends up with Lord Kilworth not marrying Catherine, but Mr. Wellesley-Pole does marry Catherine. Presumably, she was interested in the fact that he would defend her honour. Maybe she thought it was romantic. He's not that good looking. You'll notice the nose. Let's have another look at that portrait. You'll notice the nose. This is the nose in the Wellesley family that the Duke of Wellington also has, which caused his soldiers to call him Old Beaky. He becomes part of our story later on. We'll come back to Wellesley-Pole and Miss Tilney-Long when they get married, which is actually in February. So subscribe if you want to find out what happened between these two, because it's quite a story. That's this week in the Regency. I'm Elizabeth Layton. I'll see you next week in the Regency.